I thought it might be interesting to compare these two lenses. This is the Canon FD 70-210 f4 and this is the Canon EF 70-200 f4L IS. It's the first version of the f4L IS, not the Mark II. In some respects they're quite similar, in others they're very different. So that's what this video is all about. They're roughly the same zoom range. This one's a little bit longer at the long end. Roughly the same size. This one's a little bit fatter. Roughly the same weight. And the maximum aperture is f4 throughout the entire zoom range for both lenses. One of the advantages this lens has is a macro feature. It's not a true macro lens, but at the short end it allows you to decrease the minimum focusing distance so you can get in a bit closer to small subjects. This lens has lots of advantages. It has a ring zoom rather than a push-pull zoom. It has autofocus, whereas this one is manual focus. It has third generation image stabilisation, which gives you about 4 stops of IS. This one has no IS. It's a more modern design and it has better lens coatings. So if you're in the market for a Canon 70-200 f4 zoom, why on earth would you buy one of these? There are 3 reasons I can think of. The first is cost. If you buy one of these new, it will be about $1,100 US. And even if you're able to find a used one in good condition, it's still going to be quite expensive. Whereas if you're lucky, you can find one of these for virtually nothing. The second reason is that some people just enjoy playing around with old equipment. I do occasionally, and it's quite good fun. And the third reason is that there are some people who actually like the image quality from these old lenses. So in this video, let's take a bit of a closer look at the image quality of both lenses. First, let's look at the FD lens, wide open at f4 at a focal length of 70mm, and it looks pretty good. There is some vignetting. This is better on the EF lens, but that's partly because the camera knows the profile for the EF lens and it will compensate for the vignetting. Now let's take a look at the same image on the EF 70-200. This is the same image taken with the EF 70-200. In terms of sharpness, it looks about the same. This image isn't cropped. You can see it does look a lot lighter, especially in the corners. This is 100% crop with the FD 70-210. We're still at 70mm focal length and still at f4. Now let's compare it to the EF 70-200. This was taken with the EF lens at the same settings. I think the colours look a lot more natural. There's not a lot of difference with the sharpness. Maybe this one's a tiny bit sharper, but it's really a small amount. Now let's start stepping down, and this is the FD lens, still at 70mm, but we're using an aperture of f5.6. And here's the EF lens at 5.6, and I would say it's a tiny bit sharper and a tiny bit brighter. Now f8 with the FD lens, and for some reason we've lost some contrast and lost some sharpness. I'm not sure why. Now f8 with the EF lens, and I think the colours, contrast and sharpness are a definite improvement on the FD lens. And f11 on the FD lens, and there seems to be very little difference compared to the EF lens. And here's f11 on the EF lens, and as you can see there's very little difference. So shooting at a focal length of 70mm using a variety of different apertures, I think the test is quite inconclusive. There are differences, but the differences are very small. Next we're going to go to the maximum focal length. And here's the FD lens at a focal length of 210, wide open at f4. Here's the EF lens at 200mm. You can see a slight difference between 200mm and 210mm. This one's also at the maximum aperture of f4, and regarding image quality, there's not really very much difference at all. Now let's look at some cropped images at the maximum focal length. Here's the FD lens at 210mm f4. And what's interesting are these red lines around the black lines around the eyes. They aren't actually a part of the original image. This is the EF lens at its maximum focal length of 200mm at aperture f4. And you will notice that those red lines have disappeared. So although we didn't see much of a difference and we didn't really see any big problems at 70mm, at 200mm we've started to see some chromatic aberration with the FD lens. And now back to the FD lens at 210mm, but this time using an aperture of f8. And those red lines have decreased slightly, but they're still there. And here's the EF lens again at 200mm at f8, and you will see that there are no red lines. So that's the first real problem with the old FD lens. The problem can be improved by stopping down, but even at f8 it's still quite apparent. This is the FD lens at 70mm and f8. And although it doesn't look bad, you'll see a big improvement when we compare it to the EF lens. Here's the same shot with the EF lens, 70mm and f8. And just look how much better it is compared to the FD lens in terms of contrast and colours. The sky is changing all the time, of course, but you get a nice blue colour of the sky here, which I didn't see with the FD lens. Here's the same scene with the FD lens at 210mm at f8, and the subject looks fine, but just look how washed out the background sky looks. It's almost completely white. Just compare that with the EF lens I'm just about to show you. The difference is night and day. This is the EF lens at its maximum focal length of 200mm, and the exposure settings are exactly the same, 1/800th of a second at f8. And these pictures were taken minutes apart, but this one just looks so much better. And this image was taken with the FD lens using its macro mode. Usually when you want to reduce the minimum focusing distance of a lens, you need to use an extension tube. So the fact that with this one you can do that without using a tube makes it quite a handy little feature. Now to conclude, and firstly let's consider image quality. And as you will have seen with those sample images, with some images the quality is almost identical. In other images we start to see some chromatic aberration with the old lens that we don't see with the new EF lens. And in some shots there was a big difference with contrast and colours, and considering I was using the same camera, the same exposure settings, I think it must have something to do with lens coatings. Modern lens coatings make a big difference to image quality. But what you need to remember is that image quality isn't the only consideration. For those test shots I had the camera on a tripod, I was shooting static subjects, and I had all the time in the world to mess around with manual focus. In the real world you're going to be hand holding, so image stabilisation is going to be very useful. You're going to be shooting moving subjects, so autofocus is going to be very useful. And in a real world situation, those old manual focus lenses without IS are going to be quite difficult to use, and your keeper rate is going to be reduced dramatically. You can pick up these old FD lenses very cheaply. They can be fun and they're capable of producing some very good results. But to be honest, there's absolutely no comparison with modern lenses, and for me personally, there is no way that I want to go back. Thanks for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below.